Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Kenny McBride. And today Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has announced that Labour is ready to back a general election now that the EU has granted a 3-month Brexit delay, making a pre-Christmas poll all but certain. The Liberal Democrats and the Scottish National Party had suggested a one-line bill to propose an election on December 12th, and a bill to that effect has now been tabled by the government in the House of Commons. Jeremy Corbyn today said his party would also vote for it. That debate in the House of Commons is streaming live now on broadcastingscotland.scot, and we will go there live if a vote happens while we're on air. Corbyn reportedly told the Shadow Cabinet today, "I have consistently said that we are ready for an election and our support is subject to a no-deal Brexit being off the table. We have now heard from the EU that the extension of Article 50 to the 31st of January has been confirmed. So for the next 3 months, our condition of taking no deal off the table has now been met. We will now launch the most ambitious and radical campaign for real change our country has ever seen." Labour abstained on Monday when Johnson tabled a motion under the Fixed Terms Parliaments Act to call for an election, with the Shadow Cabinet split over the wisdom of an early poll. That meant that the bill did not succeed as the FTPA requires a 2/3 majority of the House to bring about an early election. Corbyn is known to thrive in a campaign setting, and his close allies have been keen to begin campaigning. The Labour Chief Whip, Nick Brown, and other key figures are more reticent, citing concerns over recent Labour poll numbers. The Labour campaign group Momentum tweeted, "Labour are officially backing an election. This is the opportunity of a lifetime to put an end to the shambolic mess the Tories have made and return hope to millions. Let's do this." Corbyn gave a televised statement at Labour HQ with his shadow cabinet applauding behind him. He said, "I'm absolutely looking forward to going to every part of the country with my wonderful shadow cabinet team here and all the fantastic Labour activists to give a message of hope where there isn't one with this government." The exact date for a general election still remains unclear. The government's bill names the 12th of December, but the Lib Dems and the SNP have objected to that date. And Downing Street said today that it would be willing to accept the 11th as a compromise. A Downing Street spokesman said the only unacceptable date for the government would be the original Lib Dem SNP proposal of the 9th of December. This would mean Parliament being dissolved this Friday to allow 25 working days between dissolution and polling. This would make it very difficult for both the election bill and a bill on the budgets for the suspended Northern Ireland Assembly to be passed and to get royal assent. Also, the 9th of December is a Monday, meaning election preparations would take place during the preceding week, which would be logistically difficult and costly. The spokesman said that the government could not accept amendments extending the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds or to EU nationals, saying that long-standing convention dictates that changes to the franchise only happen after extensive consultation. Of course, that consultation would not be needed here in Scotland. He did say that adding younger voters would be administratively impossible to deliver in the time available, warning also that adding EU nationals would bring administrative chaos. Again, this would only apply to England and Wales. These amendments were proposed earlier today, but were pulled from the order paper a couple of hours ago. That does not appear to have stopped the opposition parties from supporting the bill more generally. A Lib Dem source said the party would be willing to consider the 11th of December date, and the SNP said that no decision had yet been taken. The Prime Minister has been seeking to trigger an early poll since last week, when MPs refused to accept the government's fast-track timetable to scrutinise the Brexit deal. Over the weekend, the Lib Dems and the SNP said that they would table a one-line bill seeking to trigger a 9th of December election, which would only require a simple majority of MPs to pass. They said that date was calculated to prevent Johnson bringing his Brexit deal back to Parliament and to avoid students being disenfranchised, as the Christmas break will not yet have begun at most universities. After his motion fell on Monday, Johnson said he would table a similar bill himself. The government sought to keep the same date in the new bill today, but an amendment from Jeremy Corbyn to hold the election on the 9th has been selected for a vote this evening. Across the country, there is a widespread view that this Parliament has run its course, and that is because I simply do not believe that this House is capable of delivering on the priorities of the people, whether that means Brexit or anything else, he told MPs. The leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, then made a verbal commitment in the House not to bring back the withdrawal agreement. Also today, the Association of Electoral Administrators warned that some constituencies may need permission to delay counting votes if severe weather makes it dangerous for staff and count observers to travel safely to count centres, particularly in areas more likely to be hit by severe weather, such as the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. Existing legislation does not grant local officials enough discretion to delay proceedings if they believe that staff would be unsafe. This might also affect the collection of ballot boxes from hard-to-reach locations, like the smaller islands of Shetland. Meanwhile, Labour MP John Mann has announced that he will not stand at the next election as he has been elevated to the House of Lords, while former Tory and now Liberal Democrat MP Heidi Allen has said that she will not stand either, saying that Brexit has broken our politics. In London, the London Fire Brigade's readiness for the Grenfell Tower fire was gravely inadequate, and fewer people would have died if it had been better prepared. That's the key conclusion of a long-awaited public inquiry report into the disaster that killed 72 people. The first phase of the report into the biggest single loss of life in London since the Second World War also ruled that the building had been refurbished in breach of safety regulations, and that contrary to the evidence so far of the cladding panel manufacturer Arconic, the principal reason why the flames spread so rapidly up the building was its aluminium composite panels and the melting and dripping of burning polyethylene. The retired High Court judge Sir Martin Moore-Bick, who led the inquiry, found that despite senior officers knowing about the risk of cladding fires from high-rise fires abroad, the preparation and planning for a fire such as Grenfell by the fire brigade fell short of what should have been expected. Moore-Bick used the 1,000-page report to criticise the LFB's Commissioner Danny Cotton for remarkable insensitivity, for claiming in evidence to the inquiry that she wouldn't change anything the brigade did on the night. It showed the LFB is an institution at risk of not learning the lessons of the Grenfell Tower fire. He concluded that many lives could have been saved if her officers had identified sooner that the fire was out of control and told residents to evacuate. He found that the London Fire Brigade failed to train its incident commanders and firefighters in how to recognise the need for evacuation in the danger of combustible cladding. Survivors and bereaved family members welcomed Moore-Bick's much delayed but strong conclusions, after previously fearing he would delay making significant findings until the second phase of the inquiry, which begins next year. That will examine the refurbishment project that preceded the fire. Moore-Bick said there was already compelling evidence that the external walls of the building failed to comply with requirements of building regulations governing fire safety. They didn't adequately resist the spread of fire. The report concluded that, on the contrary, they actively promoted it. Lawyers for the LFB sought the ruling that the building breached regulations, arguing the £10 million refit completed in 2016 was catastrophically non-compliant with fire safety requirements. The Fire Brigade has said the entire safety strategy for Grenfell Tower required any fire to remain compartmentalised, and that it could not have been expected to cope if the building was changed to allow fire to spread as it did. Moore-Bick praised the extraordinary courage and selfless devotion to duty of rank-and-file officers and said, "Those in the control room and those deployed on the incident ground responded with great courage and dedication in the most harrowing of circumstances." But the absence of an operational evacuation plan for Grenfell Tower was a major omission by the LFB, which was guilty of an institutional failure to inform firefighters about the risks of cladding fires before the disaster. On the night of the fire, there was a failure of command, which meant firefighters with extended duration breathing kits were deployed too slowly. Michael Dowden, the watch manager for North Kensington Fire Station and the commander on the scene for most of the first hour, was criticised for failing to consider an evacuation sooner and for not making efforts to find out what residents were telling 999 operators or the conditions inside the building. The inquiry heard that an officer of his rank would not normally be in charge of such a huge fire, but Moore-Bick concluded, "I have little doubt that fewer people would have died if the order to evacuate had been given by 2 a.m. The report heard evidence from hundreds of witnesses, including 88 firefighters, control room officers and senior LFB commanders, together with 35 of the bereaved, survivors and residents. In September, the LFB said leaders of the brigade have been interviewed under caution by Scotland Yard detectives in relation to health and safety offences. The report is set to be published in full on Wednesday, but was circulated to the bereaved, survivors and residents on Monday morning. Those seen collecting printed copies included Nabil Choucair, who lost 6 members of his family in the fire, Clary Mendy, the aunt of the celebrated young artist Khadija Say, who died with her mother Mary Mendy, and Natasha Elcock, the chairwoman of Grenfell United, who escaped with her partner and daughter but lost her uncle, who lived on an upper floor. Everyone who received an advance copy of the report was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement before taking it away. Among the 72 victims of the fire were 19 children, and Cotton angered their relatives in her evidence when she compared preparing to tackle a fire like Grenfell to developing a training package for a space shuttle landing on the Shard. In other words, something she would never need to do. Moore-Beck addressed this, saying it showed an unwillingness to confront the fact that in October 2016, fire engineers from the brigade produced a slideshow titled Tall Building Facades, featuring cladding fires around the world. It warned of a need to understand what products are being used in the facade system and their fire behaviour. These could affect the way fires develop and spread in a building. The findings come 26 months after Theresa May set up the inquiry in the wake of the disaster that devastated the North Kensington community and sparked a national fire safety crisis. Another 400 other tower blocks in England were found to have been wrapped in similar combustible cladding to that of Grenfell Tower. Ruth Davidson still faces outstanding questions after reversing her shameful decision to work for a lobbyist while sitting as an MSP, the SNP have said. SNP MSP Gordon MacDonald commented on the situation, saying, "Ruth Davidson has made this decision only under severe pressure, and questions over her judgment and her commitment to her constituents remain. Ruth Davidson must outline what advice she was given on how her role could have possibly been in line with the MSP Code of Conduct. We also need to know whether Ms Davidson has met with any Tulkan clients, performed any work for the organisation, or given Tulkan any advice, formally or informally, that must now be declared. And crucially, we need to know whether Ruth Davidson has had any discussions about a future role in the lobbying industry. If the decision not to take the job was accompanied with a nod and a wink about work after 2021, there will remain serious concerns about the ability of Ms Davidson to perform her work as a parliamentarian. If she is to claw back any respect at all, Ruth Davidson must publish all material and advice she has received regarding this role. In the interests of transparency, the public will expect answers." Davidson, who is not expected to stand at the next Scottish election, had faced a storm of criticism ever since agreeing to take on the £50,000 25-day-per-year role with the London-based Tulkan lobbying firm. Ms Davidson accepted today that the debate about the job had become increasingly contentious. She said that as a result, she and the firm had agreed not to proceed with the appointment. The defamation action against Green MSP Andy Whiteman by Wildcat Haven Enterprises began today in Edinburgh. The case concerns a blog written by Whiteman making allegations about the legality of the company's sale of so-called souvenir plots of land to create a wildcat haven on a piece of land Whiteman claimed was not part of any wildcat conservation area. The MSP also raised significant concerns about connections between the company and an offshore tax haven. Whiteman has crowdfunded over £30,000 to assist in his defence. Wildcat Haven Enterprises has reportedly sought up to £750,000 in damages. If Whiteman loses the case, he may be forced into bankruptcy, which would force him to leave his role as an MSP. Nick Williams of Scottish Pen, the organisation promoting freedom for journalists and other writers, has criticised Scottish defamation law for allowing the case to arise at all. Writing in the Times today, Williams said the case represents a significant threat to both free expression and how we engage with private companies and individuals in Scotland. Williams noted that in Scots defamation law, there is no serious harm threshold, meaning that actions brought solely to silence criticism could come to court, insulating the pursuer from having to outline the level of harm caused. He also says there is also no public interest defence. Instead, we have to depend on a list of guidelines found in a 20-year-old House of Lords judgment. These criteria, he said, were too narrowly focused on responsible journalistic practice, assuming journalists are alone in bringing forward public interest information. Mr. Wightman, of course, made his allegations on his blog and is therefore not regarded as a journalist, so this defence may not be open to him at all. Wightman tweeted about the case last night, saying he was grateful for the opportunity to defend himself. He also noted the financial challenges he has already faced, saying, "Thank you to my legal team and once again to all 5,000 supporters, without whose generosity I would by now be bankrupt and have been removed as an MSP due purely to my inability to afford legal representation." The top Ukraine expert on the American National Security Council planned to tell Congress today that a July phone call between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky caused him to raise an internal alarm about a suspected subversion of US foreign policy by the White House. The anticipated testimony before congressional investigators by Alexander Vindman, an Army Lieutenant Colonel who was decorated with a Purple Heart after being wounded by a roadside bomb in Iraq, could weigh heavily in the impeachment inquiry against Donald Trump. Excuse me, we're having a small technical issue there. The excerpts, Vindman's planned opening testimony describing what he felt was a shocking swerve of US policy towards Ukraine was published late Monday by CNN and the New York Times. The excerpts indicate that Vindman, who planned to testify in defiance of a White House gag order, was prepared to corroborate previous damning testimony that the Trump administration mounted a campaign to pressure Ukraine into announcing an investigation of Joe Biden in exchange for military aid and a possible White House visit. "I did not think it was proper to demand that a foreign government investigate a US citizen, and I was worried about the implications for the US government's support of Ukraine," said Vindman's statement, as quoted in the New York Times. "I realized that if Ukraine pursued an investigation into the Bidens and Burisma, it would likely be interpreted as a partisan play which would undoubtedly result in Ukraine losing the bipartisan support it has thus far maintained." Burisma is a gas company on whose board Hunter Biden, the former vice president's son, served for 5 years. The White House has denied any such effort to establish a quid pro quo with Ukraine, but against mounting evidence to the contrary, Trump's defenders have argued that the president's conduct does not rise to the level of impeachment. Vindman, a Ukrainian-American immigrant and the current European Affairs Director at the National Security Council, planned to indicate in his testimony that he raised an internal alarm about the shadow US policy toward Ukraine. His opening statement suggested that he might have been one of the White House sources for a whistleblower report that began the entire impeachment inquiry. This would all undermine US national security, Vindman planned to say of Trump's 25th of July call with Zelensky. The New York Times report quoted Vindman's statement further. "I'm a patriot, and it is my sacred duty and honour to advance and defend our country, irrespective of party or politics. I did convey certain concerns internally to national security officials in accordance with my decades of experience and training, sense of duty, and an obligation to operate within the chain of command." In keeping with the previous testimony of current and former officials, including the diplomat William Taylor and the Russia expert Fiona Hill, Vindman planned to testify that he was concerned about the role the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, who was also on the payroll of opaque interests in Ukraine, was playing in crafting US policy towards the country. Vindman also planned to contradict the embattled US ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, who returned to Capitol Hill on Monday with his lawyers to review his testimony of 2 weeks earlier. In his testimony before the impeachment investigators, Sondland, who is a hotelier and Trump major donor but not a diplomat, reportedly downplayed his role in making Ukraine understand what Trump needed in exchange for military aid, which had already been appropriated by Congress. Vindman was shocked at the linkage between aid and political favours, he planned to testify, and he confronted Sondland the day Sondland spoke in a White House meeting about Ukraine delivering specific investigations in order to secure the meeting with the president. In Iraq, masked gunmen have opened fire on Iraqi protesters in the Shia holy city of Karbala, killing at least 18 people and wounding hundreds, security officials have said, in one of the deadliest single attacks on protesters since anti-government demonstrations erupted earlier this month. The attack, which happened overnight, came as Iraq took to the streets for a fifth consecutive day, protesting against corruption, lack of services, and other grievances. The bloodshed in Karbala, a major pilgrimage site where a revered Shia figure was killed in a 7th century battle, could mark a turning point in the demonstrations, in which 240 people have been killed so far this month. It was not immediately clear who was behind the attack, and protesters said they did not know whether the masked men were riot police, special forces, or Iran-linked militias. The protesters said Iraqi soldiers had been stationed around the protest site, but withdrew after the attackers began firing tear gas and live fire. Amid a clampdown by security forces, it was difficult to piece together what exactly prompted the attack. There were differing accounts and death toll estimates. The provincial governor, Nasif al-Khattabi, denied that any protesters were killed, but said that there were some injuries among security forces. He said videos that had spread online were fabricated and were not from Karbala. Footage purporting to show the aftermath of the attack showed fires and people running away to the backdrop of heavy gunfire. His description contradicted that of people who were at the scene. An Associated Press video showed a nighttime fire and young protesters, some of them taking cell phone footage, as gunfire echoed in the background. An ambulance can be seen trying to drive amid the chaos and Iraqi security forces arriving at the scene. The protests across Iraq, leaderless and largely spontaneous, have been met with bullets and tear gas by security forces. At least 73 protesters, not including the latest fatalities in Karbala, have been killed since anti-government demonstrations resumed on Friday, after 149 were killed during an earlier wave of protests earlier this month. The attacks happened in Karbala's Education Square, where protesters had set up tents. We saw masked men dressed all in black, and they fired live bullets towards the square, one demonstrator said. People fell dead and wounded right next to me. We tried to escape, but when we fled into the alleys, we ran into moving checkpoints set up by these forces. They arrested people and searched their phones for videos of what had happened. Another witness said hundreds of protesters were in the encampment when someone opened fire from a passing car. Masked gunmen in black plain clothes arrived and started shooting at the protesters. Iraqi security officials confirmed the death toll, speaking on condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to talk to reporters. Karbala, along with Baghdad and cities across southern Iraq, has been gripped by a wave of anti-government protests that have often turned violent, with security forces opening fire and demonstrators burning government buildings and headquarters of Iran-backed militias. The demonstrators have erupted in Shia-majority areas and have been directed at the Shia-dominated government and Shia political parties and militias, many of which are supported by neighbouring Iran. The demonstrations are fueled by anger at corruption, economic stagnation, and poor public services. Despite its huge oil wealth, Iraq suffers from very high unemployment and crumbling infrastructure, with frequent power outages that force many to rely on private generators. The protests have grown, and demonstrators are now calling for sweeping changes across society, not just the resignation of the government. Lebanon's Prime Minister, Saad Hariri, has announced his resignation in a move set to spark further uncertainty in a country paralysed by political dysfunction and nationwide protests. Hariri's announcement came several hours after hundreds of youths overran protest sites in downtown Beirut, ransacking tents and stalls set up by demonstrators who, for the past 13 days, have demanded an overhaul of the ruling class and an end to rampant corruption. The embattled leader said he intended to make a positive shock by quitting, claiming that by doing so served the country's dignity and safety. Over the past fortnight, he has tabled reforms, including the abolition of several cabinet positions and some cuts to spending, but the moves have fallen short of the structural changes demanded by protesters. The protests have led politicians scrambling unsuccessfully to react and have exposed the depth of feeling in Lebanon, where an imminent economic collapse threatens to cripple the country's banking system and social fabric. The depth of the crisis and lack of political solutions have galvanised Lebanese citizens from all political persuasions and walks of life, leading to a movement that shows little signs of slowing down, even after the main protest site was ransacked earlier today. The assault was blamed by demonstrators on two factions, Hezbollah and Amal, whose political leaders do not support a change in government. The Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah, the most powerful figure in Lebanon despite not holding an official position, has warned of chaos if protests were allowed to continue. Hariri's supporters spent much of today trying to talk him out of quitting, fearing even deeper instability in Lebanon, where political uncertainty and extreme levels of government debt have caused widespread alarm and spilled over in mass demonstrations, the scale of which had not been seen for more than a decade. I know for sure that the main target is the top of the system, said Ali Durrani, a 33-year-old protester. I don't expect a domino effect. What I expect is that Hariri is expendable for the regime that we are trying to topple. What people should focus on now is that we need to find an alternative. We have a problem that is rooted in the system of decision-making and the relationship between citizen and state. Back in Scotland, Scotland's chief statistician today published Homicide in Scotland 2018-19. The publication provides information on crimes of homicide recorded by the police in Scotland over that period. Between 2017-18 and 2018-19, the number of homicide cases recorded by the police in Scotland increased by 2%, or one case, from 59 to 60. This is the third lowest number of recorded homicide cases for a single 12-month period since 1976, after 59 cases were recorded in each of 2015-16 and 2017-18. The number of homicide cases in Scotland has remained relatively stable in recent years, with between 59 and 63 cases recorded each year since 2012-13. Over the 10-year period from 2009-10 to 2018-19, the number of homicide cases in Scotland fell by 25%, or 20 cases, from 80 to 60. In 2018-19, 61 victims of homicide were recorded, 3% more than the 59 recorded in 2017-18. Of the 61 victims, 75%, or 46, were male. In 2018-19, 83 persons were accused of homicide and 88% of them were male. Of the 60 cases of homicide recorded for 2018-19, 57 were solved and 3 are currently unsolved. For each of the last 10 years, the most common method of killing was with a sharp instrument. In 2018-19, a sharp instrument was the main method of killing for 44%, or 27 homicide victims. Justice Secretary Humza Yousaf responded to the figures, saying, "While the number of homicides in Scotland is significantly lower than a decade ago, in line with the overall fall in crime, any death is one too many. Behind these figures are grieving families and friends, and my sincere sympathies go out to all those who have lost a loved one. We are working to ensure that victims' interests are at the heart of our criminal justice system, and we recognise the enormous trauma experienced by families bereaved by murder and culpable homicide. As part of more than £18 million invested annually to improve support, advice and information for all victims of crime, we have funded Victim Support Scotland to deliver a free and confidential new caseworker support services for families bereaved by crime. We are determined to help people break free from cycles of violence. We will continue our efforts to drive down violent crime, both through education and enforcement, supporting prevention work with people of all ages, and ensuring Scotland law enforcement agencies and courts have the resources to deal with those who harm others." New figures published today show an increase in the number of babies being breastfed in Scotland. Public Health Minister Joe Fitzpatrick said, "I am delighted that breastfeeding rates across Scotland continue to rise, with more than half of the babies born in 2018-19 being breastfed at their first health visitor visit. These statistics also show that 43% of babies born in that year were being breastfed at their 6 to 8 week review, of which 32% were exclusively breastfed. This now represents the highest percentage of babies being exclusively breastfed at 6 to 8 weeks since recording began. We are continuing to support women to breastfeed as the normal nutrition for babies and have provided additional funding of more than £2 million for breastfeeding support. This extra funding is enabling NHS boards and third sector partners to improve the breastfeeding experiences of mothers and work is underway to meet our target of reducing the drop-off in breastfeeding rates at the 6 to 8 week point by 10% by 2025. Council leaders and key organisations across the Highlands and Islands have agreed to work with the Scottish Government to tackle population decline. While Scotland's population is increasing nationally, it is declining in rural and island communities. At a meeting in Inverness, the Convention on the Highlands and Islands has agreed to treat the issue as a priority. It has also endorsed the Scottish Government's population programme to make all communities attractive places to live, work and bring up families. The agreement will see councils and key bodies such as Visit Scotland, Highlands and Islands Enterprise and the University of the Highlands and Islands work with ministers to develop solutions at national, regional and local level. Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs Fiona Hislop said, "I welcome this collective agreement that repopulation of our rural and island communities is a challenge we need to work together to address. While the Scottish Government can implement national policies to look at the overall balance of the population, it is important these issues are also tackled where appropriate at a regional and at a local community level. This agreement will build on the work being undertaken by the Ministerial Task Force on Population and will help ensure we can support and sustain population growth in our local communities, both now and in the future." Scotland's population is at a record high of 5.4 million, although the increase is solely down to recent inward migration, since the number of deaths has exceeded the number of births. Figures published this month project that there will be 240,000 more pensioners by mid-2043, with the working age population set to fall by 7,000 over the same period. 14 councils in Scotland experienced depopulation over the last year to mid-2018, with most in rural or island areas. The Scottish Government has established a ministerial population task force to address population concerns by making communities across Scotland attractive places to live, work, bring up families and move to. And record high numbers of Scots are taking advantage of free eye tests, according to the Scottish Government's ophthalmic workload statistics, which were published today. Welcoming these figures, Public Health Minister Joe Fitzpatrick said, "I'm pleased to see that record high numbers of people are taking advantage of their entitlement to a free NHS-funded eye examination. Scotland leads the way in community eye care services provision and is the only nation in the UK to offer universal free eye examinations. Regular eye examinations help to identify potentially serious conditions like age-related macular degeneration, glaucoma and cataracts, which, if left untreated, could lead to sight loss and even blindness. They can also help identify early signs of general medical conditions such as diabetes and high blood pressure. Our new national network, Scottish Eye Care for Everyone, will use this data to raise awareness of eye examinations to make sure people in all areas of Scotland are benefiting." And Scotland's Chief Statistician today also published statistics on higher education student support in Scotland for the year 2018-19. This figure shows an increase in both the number of students supported and the amount of support provided by the Student Awards Agency Scotland for those studying in higher education in the 2018-19 academic session. There were 148,890 full-time undergraduate and postgraduate students supported, which includes those receiving any form of bursary, grant, fees or loan support, which is an increase of 0.7% from 147,920 the previous year. Other key findings include the total amount of support for full-time students was 894.3 million, an increase of 1.3% from the previous year. The average support provided per full-time student was £6,010, an increase from £5,970 in the previous year. The total amount provided in non-repayable bursaries and grants for full-time students increased by 5.3% from 76.3 million to 80.3 million, awarded to 54,550 students, which is up from 53,620. The total amount authorised in loans was 533.6 million, a 1% increase from the previous year at an average of 5,300 per student. There were 15,310 European Union students supported in this year, 10.3% of all the full-time students supported, and they received £32.1 million of support, 3.6% of the total amount of support given to all students. A further 20,740 students were provided with fee support while studying on a part-time basis. The total amount of support was £17.2 million at an average of £830 per student. This is an increase of around 1,300 students from 19,470, and that's an increase of 6.5%. It's also an increase in financial support from an average of £810. SAAS also administers supports for students undertaking courses in pre-registration nursing and midwifery, leading to the award of a degree. In 2018-19, there were 9,180 students receiving support through the Nursing and Midwifery Bursary Scheme, compared to 9,010 in the previous year. That's an increase of 1.9%. These students received £70 million in support at an average of 7,620. And nearly £210 million has been paid to 347,045 low-income households by the Scottish Welfare Fund since it was established in 2013, the newest figures show. Crisis grant applications to the fund for basic essentials such as food and heating increased by 12% from April to June compared to the same period last year. In addition, for the first time, exceptional pressure is the main reason for community care grant applications. Previously, the biggest reason for these applications was helping people to stay in their community. The fund, which enables local authorities to provide grants for people on low income, is part of the Scottish Government's mitigation efforts for UK government welfare cuts. Estimates suggest that social security spending in Scotland is set to reduce by £3.7 billion per year by 2021. Social Security Secretary Shirley Ann Somerville said, "These are yet more signals of how much families are struggling. In the face of UK government cuts and with the threat of a no-deal Brexit still alive, the risk is real that tens of thousands more people could be pushed into poverty in Scotland. The Scottish Government will not stand by and let people who are already struggling continue to face a reliance on food banks and the stress of debt and rent arrears. We will continue to spend at least £100 million each year to mitigate the worst effects of the UK government welfare cuts, part of the £1.4 billion we spent last year to support low-income households. This is money we should be able to invest elsewhere to help pull people out of poverty, but we need to use to protect the poorest and most vulnerable in our country. And we are introducing the Scottish Child Payment to tackle child poverty head-on. But there is no doubt that without the cuts inflicted on families by the UK government, this could go so much further." So that is all the news we have for you tonight. Our coverage from Westminster continues here on Broadcasting Scotland. Westminster Live, continues here on Broadcasting Scotland. It's ongoing as we speak. We expect those debates, votes on the election debate to happen at some point later this evening. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. We would just like to remind you, as always, that it is an expensive business making TV programmes, even one on as small a scale as tonight's. We are sorry, of course, that we didn't have a guest. But you can help us by signing up at broadcastingscotland.scot/register and become a supporter there. Your £5 a difference makes all the difference in the kind of programmes that we can continue to bring you. They will, of course, always remain free to view, but your money helps us do everything that we do here. So please do support us if you can. In the meantime, we will be back at the same time tomorrow, and we will, I'm sure, have Westminster Live as well. So do please join us then. Thanks for watching. Good night.